Good evening. Mr. Evans here, and we are reading Dollar for Luck by Elizabeth Coatsworth, and we are starting tonight with Chapter 3. "We're sailing tomorrow," said Cliff Trask at early breakfast. "I kind of think, Belle, we ought to hire a rig and drive up to Waldoboro and get some new merchandise. They've cleaned us pretty well out of just dress goods and men's shoes, and we're low on nails and screws, too." "If we're going, we might as well go to Thomaston. It's not much further, and we can buy cheaper," said his wife. "We'd better get an early start. Emily can tend the boat. There won't be many people now we've been here 5 days. But you mind what I say, Emily. You stay right aboard all the time we're gone, and don't you go wool gathering off ashore. The people of Friendship are as honest as they come, but there's bound to be one or two bad apples in any barrel, and there's a valuable cargo aboard, as you well know." "Yes'm," said Emily, looking at nothing and no one. Belle Trask reached over and shook her, not unkindly. "Wake up, Emily, wake up. Now mind what I say. Don't you leave the schooner, you hear me?" "Yes'm," repeated Emily in the same dead-alive voice. "Honestly, you try the patience of a saint," cried Belle. "She heard you," Cliff interposed. "She won't leave, will you, Emily? But you and me'd better be starting, Belle. I spoke yesterday to Luke Genther, and he said we could have his rig." Belle put on her bonnet and shawl, but she was still uneasy as she went down the gangplank after her husband. "Emily, you sweep up the deck and clean up the cabin, and polish the lucky dollar. I noticed it's getting dull looking. And there's some clams in the pail for your dinner, and all the bread you need. Now you remember my words. You stay aboard this schooner and don't set foot even on the wharf," she added, looking back as she slowly walked away. "Yes'm," said Emily, scarcely lifting her eyes. At last Mrs. Trask was driven to threats. "You do what I say or you'll get what for," she called back darkly. "Yes'm," agreed Emily. "That girl," said Mrs. Trask to her husband as she joined him. "She's like heavy dough. I thought after we'd had her for a while she'd lighten up, but she's heavy as she ever was. I think we'd better take her back to the asylum this fall, and see if we can't get one who'll suit us better." "Just as you say. Maybe we might try a boy this time." "Anything'd be better than Emily. She's all right in herself, but not with us somehow." "Yeah, she's a good shoe, but she don't fit our foot," agreed Cliff Trask. "We'd be better off with someone else, and she'd be better off too. It's kind of a pity when anyone as young as Emily ain't happy." "She don't try to be happy," snapped Mrs. Trask. But later, as she settled into the seat beside her husband and the team started off, she said in a gentler voice, "I don't know as Emily can be happy at sea. She's got such a hankering for the land." Emily, left alone in the early morning, began her work valiantly. She swept the deck first so that she could keep an eye on the village and watch it waking up as the smoke appeared like a plume, first from one chimney and then another, and small distant doors opened upon small figures of men emerging, with milking pails which winked in the newborn light. Cocks crowed, answering one another, and a dog barked excitedly as a boy ran down the slope to the shore, bent probably on fishing. Now came an occasional pounding, as stakes were driven into the damp earth for hitching out cows, and a calf bawled after its mother, and a woman called her family in to breakfast. The little village, high above the harbor, seemed to shine in white paint, outlined on green fields. The sheds were red, with gilded weather vanes, and there were flowers in the shelter of the ells. To Emily, mechanically sweeping the deck of the E Pluribus Unum, Friendship looked like a village in heaven, with the July light of heaven shining upon it. Her eyes swept with disdain past the wharf to the fish houses beyond, with their bait tubs and lobster pots and the painted markers hung against their old shingles. She hated the smell of bait and tar and dead fish which rose all around her. But along the shore there were little paths and raspberry thickets, where the fruit was ripe now, for she had seen some women in sunbonnets picking there only yesterday. A man rowed past her, standing at the oars and facing the way he was going. He nodded to her, and she nodded back to him. But he was a fisherman, and the people who interested her were the happy people moving about the houses. At last, with a sigh, she began sweeping the rest of the deck, but even here she could watch the islands, which were so near that she could hear a robin singing in an oak tree by the shore. When the day had advanced a little, she fed the kittens and played with them for a while. Then she brought a cloth and polished the dollar fastened to the mast. Clifford Trask, who had nailed it there 20 years ago, set great store by it. If that dollar ever left the schooner, all our luck would go with it, he used to say. Emily knew that it was the first money he had taken in over the counter when he opened his shop. The schooner was named for it, and was built in the year the dollar was minted. So long as that dollar was safely nailed to the mast, there'd be no lack of dollars in Cliff Trask's pocket and Belle Trask's pocketbook. So Emily polished carefully, if with little enthusiasm, and then, sighing sadly, went with heavy feet down into the cabin to make the narrow bunks and wash the thick dishes. No one came aboard all the morning, except for a little girl sent to buy a spool of white thread, and she ran right off with it because she said that her mother was waiting already to thread her needle as soon as she got home. Emily had her dinner alone, except for the kittens. Her work was done. The Trasks wouldn't be back until early evening. Sometime before sunset, or soon after, Belle Trask had said. Now there was nothing for Emily to do. It was hot. The pluribus was slowly settling as the tide went out, and the wet mudflats began to appear along the shores. Most of the fishing boats had left long ago, and the wharves were deserted except for an old man or two sitting on shaded benches by distant fish houses, whittling. With all her heart and soul, Emily longed for the land. She wanted to go back to Mrs. Philbrook's kitchen, to see Ken again, to hear the pleasant sounds of building from the boatyard below, as she had talked with Mrs. Philbrook. But Belle Trask had told her not to set foot so much as on the wharf. But if she went to the shore where the wild raspberries were growing, she could keep her eye on the pluribus while she worked. She would face towards the harbor. A mouse couldn't get aboard without her seeing it. What could be the harm of that? Emily found an empty lard pail and went ashore. The tide was so low she had to climb up on the rail, and from there scramble to the wharf, but she was nimble. With her heart beating guiltily, she hurried to the shore and turned right to where the raspberries grew at the foot of the meadow. Though there had been pickers the day before, none came this hot afternoon, and Emily had the place to herself. At first she looked up at the schooner between every berry or two, but the quiet afternoon lulled her, and she didn't see the man and big boy in sea boots until they were standing right over the pluribus, looking down at her deck. And the man had called, not very loud, "Ahoy there! Anyone aboard?" Emily piped up in her clear voice from the shore, "Want anything, mister?" At the sound of her voice, the man swung around and studied her for a minute in silence. Then he said, "Nope, I guess not. Just wanted to see if your folks would like some clams." She saw then that the big boy was carrying a pail. "We got all the clams we can use," she called back, and then added, "I'm sorry." The man didn't answer, but the two walked off and disappeared. Emily, watching them, noticed that the pail was leaky. They'd better put some more water in that pail or the clams will die, she thought. Wonder he didn't buy a new one. Too poor, maybe. for the two had seemed poor, or at least as though they didn't have a woman to look after them. Somehow they didn't walk or talk quite like the other people in Friendship. But she was more interested in her raspberries than in strangers, and forgot them as soon as they were out of sight. There were perhaps not very many ripe berries, but the ones she found were large and delicious. There were birds in the thickets, too, which flew up with a whir of wings, and the swallows were skimming back and forth across the summer clouds, now high, now low, and the young bobolinks were perched on the goldenrod stems, while one old bird sang from the dark summit of a spruce. After a while she came to a small thicket, and in it she found something delightful. It was a pilot house, taken from some old vessel named the Thomas E. Bailey, and brought ashore and put under a pine tree, from whose roots rose a very small spring of clear water, where the bunchberries grew thick. The whole front of the little building was of glass, and inside Emily could see a small stove set against the back wall, and an army cot with a couple of old patchwork quilts on it. There was a pile of paperback books on a shelf with some china, a bow with its arrows in a corner, a big colored picture of a four-master tacked on the wall, not quite straight, and a rusty skillet on the stove. Emily gave a delighted look and hurried back to the field to make sure that the schooner was all right. She could see all the deck except for a little space behind the cabin. The remaining tin pans and pails shone in the shrouds. The brooms and mops hung in their depleted clusters. All was well. She ducked back to explore the building she had discovered. At her touch, the handle turned and the door swung open, letting her into a hot and airless little room. Dust lay on everything. In the corners, spiders sat in their webs, watching her. No one had slept in that bed for a long time. She picked up a book with a picture on the cover of boats leaving a burning ship. Ken P. was written on the first page, and then in a straggling handwriting came, "Steal not this book, my honest friend, for fear the gallows will be thy end." I suppose his pop put this up here for Ken sometime, and maybe he used it a lot for a while, and then got tired of it. Wish I had time to give it a good reading up, she thought. But she didn't have time. Always the Trasks were at the back of her mind, and Belle's repeated warnings. Maybe she hadn't done quite what Belle wanted, but she'd certainly kept an eye on the storeboat anyway. As she went out, closing the door carefully behind her, she noticed that the path through the grove was nearly overgrown. That Ken, always hankering after water, didn't seem to realize that the only good craft is a craft ashore. Emily picked berries for a while longer, and then sat in the field with a view of the schooner, and watched swallows and ants and ladybugs, and a woman hanging out clothes on a line at a house close by the shore of the nearest island. When the sun began to get low, Emily knew she'd better return, or the Trasks might catch her on shore, and there'd be a terrible scene. Belle wasn't an unkind woman, but she had a rough tongue when her temper was roused, and she'd have a right to be mad if anyone deliberately went and disobeyed her the way Emily had. She's never licked me yet, Emily thought, but if she found me off the pluribus, she would this time, and I wouldn't blame her. I'd better eat the rest of the berries and get aboard quick, and get my face and hands washed. Hope I haven't gotten any stains on my dress. A little uneasily, she trotted down the wharf and lowered herself onto the pluribus. The tide was only beginning to rise, and there was still a steep descent. The kittens rushed to meet her, mewing pathetically. "Where have you been?" their thin little voices asked. "Where have you been?" For they had never been left alone before. Emily picked them up, comforting them with small, loving noises. Here she was, back again in her prison. She glanced about her with experienced eyes. Mercy, what was that? She was sure that there had been a pail hanging there just within reach, but it was gone. And there were 4 brooms instead of 5, and only 1 clam rake left, and an axe was gone, and a hoe, and goodness knows what else. But she had never been out of sight for more than 3 minutes at a time. Could someone have rowed up on the further side and thrown up a rope and climbed aboard, keeping the cabin between him and her figure on the shore? And 2 or 3 overalls were gone from the cabin, and a blanket. Oh, 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 oh. In blind terror, Emily ran back on deck. As she passed the mast, her tear-filled eyes were aware that something further was wrong, something far more serious even than the disappearance of so much merchandise. The $1872 had been wrenched from its nail, and now only a circle of varnished, lighter wood showed where it had once been. The luck of the E pluribus unum was gone. And just then Emily heard the well-known voices of Cliff and Belle Trask above the rattle of a surrey as it came down the steep hill from the village. Chapter 4. Ken had, on the whole, had a pretty unsatisfactory day. When he saw the Trasks drive by in Luke Genthner's rig early that morning, he'd had it in mind to go down to see Emily in the storeboat and have a look at the Eagle to see if it looked as it had when he had painted it. But his father and mother seemed bound and determined to spoil his day. It was, Ken, run and get me a half-pound box of Lipton's tea and a bag of salt at Mrs. Drew's, and I mean now. And from Ma. And it was, Ken, we need some clearing up around the shop. Suppose you could sweep up the shavings and stack the odds and ends for kindling this morning? From Dad. And it was, fetch this and hand me that from Ralph and Stuart. And then a whole family of cousins had driven over to see them from Nobleborough. And while the men were looking over the sloop and Dad was explaining all the changes he was making, and Cousin Edith was talking to Ma, rocking on the porch, he had to entertain a whining boy cousin and 2 girls who lugged dolls around with them everywhere they went and were afraid even to get into a dory. They'll have to go home early, Ken thought hopefully. Cousin Ed's got the cows to milk. But Cousin Ed had made an arrangement about the milking with his next-door neighbor, and they didn't actually go until nearly 5 o'clock, after 2 or 3 false starts. Ken waved them off, as in duty-bound, then bolted before anyone could ask him to do anything else. He had some bait and a fish line in the pea-pod, keeping cool under the seat, and he had been thinking of fishing all day. It was still quite low tide, but by that time most of the flats were covered, though he could see the bottom clearly through the shallow water. His flat-bottomed, square-ended little boat could go almost anywhere. He moseyed along. Once he stopped for some time to watch a foot-long squid on a bed of seaweed out on the water. He couldn't imagine how it had got there, but it kept quivering and turning from scarlet to emerald green to violet to blue. He had never seen anything like it before, with its short tentacles and flat, almost anchor-shaped tail, so ugly in shape and so strangely beautiful in color. When at last the creature turned white, he realized that it was dead and rowed on along toward the shore. He could see through the water where Alonzo Durgan had pulled out his dory. There was the narrow groove where the keel had scraped and the oozy print of his boots. Then beyond, he could see where Dale Fraser and young Dale had been clamming. There were the footprints and the bottom dug up in patterns. He hoped vaguely that they'd got a good haul. They always looked so ragged, ever since they'd arrived last summer from up coast and camped out in old Mr. Young's fish house, which he wasn't using anymore. Dad said he knew they were the ones who'd taken a lot of his potatoes and beets out of the garden last year, but he guessed he could spare something if folks needed it that bad, and this year he'd planted some extra, counting they'd take it. Ma said they were shiftless, and she wouldn't be surprised any day if they sneaked something off of her line. But she mended up an old coat of Dad's and some trousers and a sweater of Ralph's and sent them down to the Frasers by Ken. They looked real neat when Maud got through with them, but they were all in rags like the rest of their stuff before the Frasers had worn them a month. Ken could see the round marks where the pails had stood while they were being filled. There was a lot a person could tell just by tracks. And then he saw something that looked small and white like a sand dollar and yet different. It was right beside some of the dug-up bottom. What in creation, thought Ken, and giving one oar a tug, he reached overboard and down into the cold clear water, and at his first attempt brought up the $1872. He recognized it at first glance. How did it ever get there, he thought. The coin was twisted a little, as if it had been wrenched from its heavy nail, but he would know it anywhere with the hole in the middle. What was it doing off the schooner, and what did the Frasers have to do with it? The day was beginning to darken with late afternoon clouds back in the west. It had been hot, and now there was the promise of a thunderstorm in the air. Ken looked over his shoulder towards the store boat, and was surprised to see a girl's figure running along the wharf towards the shore. It must be Emily, he thought. There was trouble of some kind aboard, and he'd better go over. But, rowing, he lost sight of the short gingham dress he had seen, bright in the last light before the storm. He was some distance up harbor, and by the time he hailed the pluribus, there was no sign whatever of Emily, but Ginther's rig was on the wharf, and Clifford and Belle Trask were running toward the deck, sometimes yelling to each other about some new thing that had been taken, and sometimes hollering for Emily. When Ken appeared with the lucky dollar, they both felt better. The first thing Cliff did was to straighten it out on an anvil he had, covering it first with felt, and then he nailed it back in its place on the mast. Now things will work out, he said. First tell us just where you found it, Ken. So Ken told him, his blue eyes snapping with excitement. Looks like Emily had been ashore after all. I knew she'd leave the boat, said Belle. I'm sick and tired of that girl. And someone sneaked onto the pluribus, maybe up the side, and stole what he wanted. Mostly things a clamor would like when I come to think of it. How do you figure the dollar got in the water? His clothes are always full of holes, and probably it worked through a hole in his pocket while he was busy digging, and he never noticed. Looks like a case for the sheriff. Who's sheriff here? Carl Vinall. We'll go have a talk with him. Want to come, Belle? We'll get someone to keep the boat while we're away. The Trasks quickly unloaded their purchases and locked them into the cabin. By now, half a dozen men and boys, scenting trouble as seagulls scent fish, had gathered, and Cliff chose an acquaintance to stay aboard. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, but by the time he had picked up Carl Vinall in the Ginther rig and driven down to the Fraser fish house, word had somehow reached the Clamors that the law was closing in upon them, for they had gone off in a hurry, leaving their supper half-eaten on the table and the stove going full blast. They had also left behind most of the stolen loot, which Cliff and Belle identified. By this time the thunder was rolling and roaring continually back of the village, and a deep dusk had closed in so that one could not even see the islands. The first lamps had been lighted in the houses, and though a few streaks of pale yellow showed below the clouds, it would be dark in half an hour, except where the lightning was beginning to fork down the airy terraces of the clouds. We got almost everything back, except a couple of hunting knives and a dollar watch, said Belle, looking around. It don't look like these folks had much themselves, does it, Cliff? No, said Cliff. I'm satisfied, Mr. Vinall. Why don't we let the matter drop? We don't want to prosecute. It would have never happened in the first place if that girl of ours had stayed where she belonged. Ken, who had of course gone along with the Trasks, now spoke up. "Where is Emily?" "Yes, where is she?" repeated Belle. "She'd slipped my mind in the excitement, but we've got to find her. It's beginning to rain, too, and getting as black as the inside of a cow." That is the end of chapter 4 and the end of our reading for tonight. I will see you again tomorrow evening, and we will begin with chapter 5. Have a good evening.